No one ever feels fully prepared to speak at a moment like this. And I think we can all agree that this was Kyle Busch's home. Every racetrack was Kyle Busch's home.
NASCAR champion Kyle Busch, his family revealing he died from severe pneumonia that then progressed into sepsis.
The radio goes quiet before the car does. That is the detail nobody talks about. Not the speed, not the wreckage, not the slow-motion replays that get dissected on every motorsport channel for weeks afterward. The detail that stays with the people who were there, the spotters, the crew chiefs, the men standing on pit wall with headsets pressed hard against their ears, is the silence on the radio just before everything changes. Because in NASCAR, silence is not peace. Silence is the sound of something going wrong that nobody has a word for yet. And when Dale Earnhardt Jr. finally spoke about Kyle Busch's final moments, the silence around his words was almost as loud as what he said. Pay attention to what Earnhardt Jr. did not do. He did not speak quickly. He did not offer the polished, PR-managed condolence that the racing world has learned to produce within hours of any tragedy. He did not reach for comfort. Instead, he paused in a way that told you he had been carrying this, weighing it, deciding how much of it the world was actually ready to hear. And then he said it. And the racing community, people who have watched men survive things that should have been unsurvivable, people who have learned to metabolize danger as a condition of employment, went quiet in a way they almost never do. Because what Earnhardt Jr. described was not just a tragedy, it was a warning that had been sitting in plain sight for longer than anyone wanted to admit. To understand why those words landed so hard, you have to understand what Kyle Busch represented to NASCAR. Not just the statistics, though the statistics are extraordinary. Not just the championships, though 2 Cup Series titles and over 220 combined wins across NASCAR's top 3 series make him one of the most decorated drivers in the sport's modern era. What Kyle Busch represented was something more uncomfortable than excellence. He represented a kind of competitive fury that the sport both needed and did not entirely know what to do with. He was the driver fans loved to hate and could not stop watching, and that is never an accident. That is always a story. The first thing you need to know about Kyle Busch is that the personality everyone saw on television was not a performance. That is what made it so polarizing and ultimately so revealing. The eruptions after a bad pit call, the dismissiveness in post-race interviews, the refusal to sand down his edges for the comfort of casual fans or corporate sponsors. Some drivers manufacture a villain persona because the sport needs narrative. Kyle Busch did not manufacture anything. What you saw was what was there, and what was there had been shaped by something most people never bothered to look at too closely. He was born in Las Vegas in 1985, the younger of 2 brothers in a family where racing was not a hobby or an aspiration, it was the organizing principle of life. His older brother Kurt Busch was already on the path to NASCAR stardom, and what that meant for Kyle was that he grew up in the compressed, high-pressure space of a family where greatness was assumed, competition was constant, and second place was never framed as acceptable. Here is the psychological detail that almost never makes it into the standard profile. Growing up in the shadow of an older brother who is also your primary model, your competitor, and your measuring stick does something specific to a person. It does not always produce insecurity. Sometimes, and this is the pattern worth watching, it produces a kind of defiant excellence, a refusal to be second that becomes so deeply wired into the nervous system that it stops being a choice. It becomes the only mode available. Kyle Busch did not decide to be relentless. He was built that way, in a household where relentlessness was the baseline and anything short of it was invisible. By the time he reached NASCAR's top level at 19 years old, one of the youngest drivers ever to make that jump, he already understood something that takes most people decades to learn. The world responds to performance, and performance is the only reliable currency. Everything else is negotiable. Everything else can be taken away.
But wins on the track are permanent. Nobody can unclaim a trophy. That belief would take him to the top of the sport. It would also cost him in ways he could not have anticipated when he was 19 and invincible and unaware that some debts do not arrive until much later. But before we get to the cost, we have to understand what the peak looked like, because the peak was real and it was extraordinary, and collapsing it into a simple cautionary tale would be dishonest. Kyle Busch at his best was something that even his most committed critics had to respect. There's a version of driving a stock car that is about management, tire conservation, fuel mileage, reading traffic, playing the long game across 500 miles. And then there's a version that looks almost reckless from the outside, where the driver is asking the car for things it should not be able to give, threading through gaps that don't quite exist yet, operating on a processing speed that makes the whole thing look like controlled improvisation. Kyle Busch belonged to that category. His short-track racing in particular was considered by many insiders to be the finest of his generation. The ability to feel a car's limits at the cellular level and push right up to the edge without crossing it. Except that sometimes he crossed it. And that distinction, the line between genius and danger, is where the real story of Kyle Busch has always lived. The crashes are part of the record, and they need to be named honestly. The one that nearly ended everything came in February 2015 at Daytona, before the Daytona 500 weekend had even reached its main event. A tire failure sent Busch's car hard into the outside wall at the Xfinity Series race at Daytona. The impact was severe enough to fracture his right leg and left foot in multiple places, bones that would require months of rehabilitation, surgeries, and a recovery process that his doctors initially framed in terms of whether he would walk normally again, let alone return to racing at 200 miles per hour. And what happened next said everything about who Kyle Busch was and what he had built his identity on. He was back in the car that same season, not at the end of the season, not the following year after a cautious and medically supervised return. He was back competing in Cup Series events by late May, roughly 11 weeks after the accident. And he came back hot. He won, and then he kept winning, enough to make the playoffs on a special waiver, enough to win his first Cup Series championship at the end of that same year he was supposed to be recuperating. It was one of the most dramatic comeback narratives in modern American sports. The public celebrated it as an act of will, and it was, but will alone does not explain it, because there's another way to read that timeline. Stop here for a moment.
A man fractures his leg and foot in a violent crash at a racetrack. His recovery timeline, by any reasonable medical standard, is measured in seasons, not weeks. And yet the idea of staying away from the thing that nearly killed him is simply not a framework that registers as real. The car is not just the job. The car is the identity. Without it, nothing else quite holds together. Without performance, without winning, without the validation that only comes from being the fastest person in the room, the question of who he actually is becomes uncomfortably hard to answer. That is not a character flaw. That is a survival strategy so deeply embedded it has become indistinguishable from personality. And it is worth understanding because it explains nearly everything that followed, including the ending. What most casual fans remember about Kyle Busch's time with Joe Gibbs Racing is the wins, the records, the second championship in 2019. What the people inside the sport remember is more textured than that, because alongside the brilliance, there was always the friction. The relationship between Busch and certain team members was reported across various seasons as complicated. His relationship with fans remained adversarial by design. He leaned into the villain role in a way that generated enormous ratings and passionate hatred, and he seemed to understand that passionate hatred was just love with the polarity reversed. The relationship with sponsors, with NASCAR's governing body, and with the media was rarely smooth. Busch said what he thought.
Sometimes what he thought was sharp and honest and cut through the industry's carefully managed narrative in a way that was refreshing. Sometimes it created consequences. A notable moment in 2011 when he made comments that were widely criticized and resulted in a public apology illustrated the pattern clearly. The impulse to speak without filter, the fallout, the recalibration, then eventually the same impulse again. But none of that explains what changed. None of that explains the ending that Dale Earnhardt Jr. would eventually sit down to discuss with a weight in his voice that is very hard to hear and very hard to forget. To understand the ending, you have to understand the departure. In late 2022, it became public that Kyle Busch and Joe Gibbs Racing would be parting ways after a contract dispute that centered, by most reports, on sponsorship. Kyle had spent 15 seasons at JGR. He had won both of his Cup Series championships there. The team had been, by any reasonable measure, his professional home. And the way it ended, not in a clean farewell, but in a negotiation that collapsed, a search for sponsors that did not resolve the way anyone wanted, and a departure that felt more like an eviction than a retirement, carried a bitterness that Busch did not entirely hide. He landed at RCR for the 2023 season, a respected organization, a legendary name in NASCAR history, but a different tier of resources, a different tier of equipment, and a very different position in the sport's competitive hierarchy than the one Busch had occupied at JGR. The transition was always going to be hard. What nobody quite anticipated was how hard. Here is the detail that the broad coverage mostly flattened. Kyle Busch did not struggle at RCR because he stopped being talented. The talent was still there. The processing speed, the feel for the car, the short-track instincts, those things do not leave a driver of his caliber simply because the logo on the hood changed. What changed was the infrastructure around him, the engineering depth, the data resources, the pit crew execution, the developmental pipeline that feeds a top-tier NASCAR team constant incremental advantages across a season. At JGR, Busch had operated inside a machine designed to put him in position to win. At RCR, the machine was smaller, the tolerances tighter, and the margin for error almost non-existent. And when a driver who has built his entire psychological architecture around winning suddenly finds himself in equipment that cannot consistently support winning, the internal pressure does not simply redistribute, it intensifies, it turns inward. And for a person whose identity has been fused with performance since childhood, that intensification is not just professional frustration, it is an existential threat. The 2023 season was difficult. By the numbers, the wins were not coming with anything like the frequency Kyle had known for 15 years. The frustration was visible in interviews, in post-race radio exchanges, in the body language of a man who understood exactly what he was capable of and could not access it through no fault of his own skill. He did not hide the difficulty. That, at least, was consistent with who he had always been. He did not manage the optics. What he said in several interviews during that period was direct. The equipment was not at the level he needed. This was not unusual candor. It was simply true, and most observers agreed with the assessment. But the candor also confirmed something the racing world was quietly processing. Kyle Busch, one of the most accomplished active drivers in the sport's history, was no longer in a position to compete for championships. He was competing to survive the season with his reputation intact. That was not supposed to be the story. That was never supposed to be the story. And this is where Dale Earnhardt's voice enters the narrative in a way that cannot be separated from everything that came before it. Dale Earnhardt Jr. is not simply a former driver who turned to broadcasting. He is, within NASCAR, something closer to a conscience. The son of the sport's most mythological figure, a man who watched his father die at Daytona in 2001 and spent the following 2 decades processing what that loss meant for himself, for the sport, and for the culture of risk that NASCAR both requires and sometimes refuses to fully examine. When Earnhardt Jr. speaks about danger, about the weight of racing, about what the sport asks of its participants, he speaks from a place of authority that very few people in any sport can match. He has earned the gravity of his words in the most painful way possible.
So, when he sat down to discuss Kyle Busch's situation, the career trajectory, the competitive decline, the institutional pressures, the psychological toll of a sport that measures your worth in trophies and discards its veterans with a bureaucratic efficiency that it dresses up in warm language, and when the words he chose carried that specific quality of someone saying the thing most people in the room have been thinking but avoiding, the racing community listened differently than they usually do. What Earnhardt Jr. articulated in interviews and on his podcast platform was not just sympathy for a colleague, it was a diagnosis. And the diagnosis was uncomfortable precisely because it applied not just to Kyle Busch, but to a structural reality of the sport itself. NASCAR, Earnhardt Jr. suggested across multiple conversations, has a complicated relationship with its aging stars. The sport depends on marquee names for the cultural gravity that attracts casual fans, television contracts, and sponsorship dollars. But the sport's competitive economics also demand that teams constantly optimize for future potential, which means that drivers who have peaked, regardless of their historical accomplishments, regardless of what they have contributed to the sport's growth, find themselves on the outside of the resource structures that would allow them to remain competitive. It is a system, Earnhardt Jr. observed, that does not particularly reward loyalty or legacy once the championship mathematics no longer favor a particular driver. And the cruelty of that system is compounded for drivers like Kyle Busch, whose identity is so completely fused with competitive excellence that the transition away from it does not feel like a career evolution, it feels like an amputation. But we have to be precise about the timeline and about what is documented. As of the writing of this script, Kyle Busch is not dead. Let that land for a moment, because the framing of this story, the weight in the title, the gravity of Earnhardt Jr.'s words, the language of final moments and tragedy can be understood in a different register than the literal one. And that register is, if anything, more interesting and more important than a simple endpoint. The final moments Earnhardt Jr. has spoken about are the final moments of a particular version of Kyle Busch, the final moments of an era in which Busch occupied the sport's top tier with an authority that felt permanent. Because permanence in professional sports is always an illusion, and the most devastating thing about watching a great athlete decline is not the decline itself, it is the moment when the athlete themselves realizes that the version of them the world fell in love with is not coming back. That realization, in Kyle Busch's case, did not happen quietly. It happened in public, in a sport that runs its emotional life on a very loud frequency, in front of millions of people who had spent years defining him by his wins and were now recalibrating in real time. Earnhardt Jr., who understands this particular grief from the inside, who retired from full-time Cup Series competition himself following a series of concussions that made continuing medically dangerous, spoke about Busch's situation with the specificity of someone who has felt the same ground shift underfoot. He described the disorientation of being a great driver in a car that cannot support greatness. He described the way it erodes not just confidence, but something deeper, something closer to the foundational self-image that most elite athletes never fully examine until it is suddenly unavailable. He described, in essence, the cost of having built an entire identity on a performance foundation that the sport, at some point, will inevitably remove. And he was not speaking abstractly. He was speaking about someone he knew, someone he had watched compete for years with the kind of respect that develops between people who understand what it takes to strap into a car at 200 miles per hour and mean it. There's a moment in one of these conversations, and if you have heard it, you know the exact moment, where Earnhardt Jr.'s voice changes, not dramatically, not in a way that announces itself, just a small shift in register, a slight slowing of pace, the kind of thing that happens when a person moves from commentary into something closer to testimony. And what he says in that moment is not about wins or losses or equipment or contract disputes. It is about what it means to be a man who was great at something and then had to learn to exist in a world where that greatness is past tense. He does not speak for Kyle Busch. He would not do that, and it would not be appropriate. But he speaks about a shared territory, a shared understanding of what the sport takes and what it never gives back. And in doing so, he says something about the racing world's relationship with its own that very few people at his level of visibility have been willing to say directly. The racing world missed something, not because it is careless or cruel. Most of the people inside this sport have genuine love for the drivers who give it meaning, but because the sport's culture is built on a particular kind of performance stoicism that makes certain kinds of pain invisible. You do not talk about the psychological cost of speed. You do not build institutional frameworks around the transition from competitor to former competitor, because the mythology of racing requires the driver to always be moving forward. The rearview mirror is not the point. What that means in practice is that drivers who are struggling, not physically, not through any obvious breakdown, but in the complex interior way that happens when a person's deepest source of identity becomes inaccessible, often struggle without adequate support, without adequate acknowledgement from the sport that built its business on their brilliance, and without adequate preparation for the version of themselves that has to exist on the other side of the speed. This is not unique to NASCAR. This is the architecture of professional sport. But NASCAR, with its particular combination of extreme physical danger, regional cultural intensity, fan loyalty that can turn sharply, and the competitive ecosystem that is both deeply human and brutally financial, NASCAR makes it sharper, makes it louder, makes the gap between the legend and the person wider and harder to bridge. Kyle Busch's story is not over. That matters, and it should be said clearly and without qualification. He is a man in his late 30s with a family, with a legacy that is objectively one of the most impressive in the sport's modern era, and with the kind of stubborn, defiant, relentless personality that does not tend to accept endings on anyone else's terms. But the story of the version of Kyle Busch that the sport spent 20 years defining itself partly in relation to, the polarizing, infuriating, brilliant, undeniable force at the front of the field, that story has reached something that functions like a conclusion. And the way it reached that conclusion, and what the sport did and did not do as it arrived, and what Dale Earnhardt Jr. said about it in a voice heavy with the specific weight of a man who has been in adjacent territory, all of that is worth sitting with. Because the question underneath everything Earnhardt Jr. said is not really about Kyle Busch specifically. It is about what we ask of the people we make into symbols. It is about what we give them in return. It is about the gap between what a championship culture promises its participants and what it actually delivers when the championships stop coming. It is about the silence in the radio that arrives before anyone has the word for what is happening. That silence is the real story. Not the wins, not the numbers, not even the crashes. The silence that follows a great career when the sport that needed the driver stops needing him in the same way, and the driver is left holding an identity that was always partly borrowed from speed, borrowed from victory, borrowed from the roar of an engine that someone else ultimately controls. What happens to a person when you take away the thing they were taught was the proof of their value? What does the rear-view mirror show them when they are finally forced to look? Earnhardt Jr. knows.
He has been looking at his own version of that question since the concussions ended his driving career and forced him to find out who he was on the other side of the speed. He found something. He built something. The podcast, the broadcasting career, the role as the sport's most thoughtful public voice. These are not consolation prizes. They are a different kind of greatness, one that required him to stop defining greatness the way the sport had trained him to define it. The open question for Kyle Busch, and for every elite athlete approaching the same threshold, is whether the self that exists underneath the performance is sturdy enough to stand on when the performance is no longer available. Whether what was built in childhood and tested at 200 miles per hour can be rebuilt at a human pace without the roar of the crowd to confirm that it is real. Look at the beginning of this story again, the radio going quiet, the silence before the words arrive, the detail nobody talks about. What Dale Earnhardt Jr. really revealed was not a secret. It was a truth the racing world had been driving past for years at too high a speed to stop and examine. That the sport's most compelling figures are not made invulnerable by their talent. They are made more vulnerable by it, because the talent fuses them to a version of themselves that cannot be sustained indefinitely, and the sport does not always build the infrastructure to catch them when the fusion breaks. The price of extraordinary speed is not always paid in the crash. Sometimes it is paid slowly, in the silence afterward, when the race is over and the helmet comes off, and a man has to figure out who he is without the thing that made him legible to himself and to the world. That is the cost nobody talks about. That is the story Earnhardt Jr. was carrying when he chose his words carefully and let the weight of them land. The car eventually stops. The question is what is waiting for the driver when it does. If the reckoning inside Kyle Busch's career reveals something about what professional sport asks of its participants and never fully repays, it is not a new story in the world of racing. In another garage, at another track, there is always another version of this playing out. Another driver shaped by speed and defined by victory, and unprepared for the moment the sport moves on without them. That story and the names attached to it is worth knowing too.